Hi there, it's Mr. Poi. Today I'm reading the Egypt game, and we're on chapter 18, Where is Security? The next day, all 6 Egyptians waited with great impatience for the end of school and the time to meet in the land of Egypt. Everyone was anxious to see if April's question would be answered, but 2 of the Egyptians had a special reason of their own to be impatient. Marshall had lost his octopus Security, and there was reason to believe that it had been left in Egypt the night before. Marshall wanted Security back, and Melanie wanted Marshall to quit pestering her and be himself again. The night before, when everyone had left Egypt in such a hurry, they had been too busy getting away from the rain and the darkness and question mysteriously answered to remember about Security. Not even Marshall had thought of it. And then, just as Marshall and Melanie got back to their apartment, their dad had come in early from the university. He had just been promised a teaching assistantship for the spring semester, and he had been in the mood for a celebration. He had rushed Marshall and Melanie into the car, and they had driven to the school where their mom taught, and then they had all gone out to dinner. It was an exciting and unusual evening because until Dad got out of school, money was scarce, and they didn't eat out very often. In fact, it had been such an interesting evening that Marshall hadn't even time to remember about Security until they were home. Melanie had been climbing into bed when Marshall came into her room. The minute she had looked at him, she had known what was wrong. Either Security was lost or the world was coming to an end. It had to be that serious. Of course, Marshall had wanted to go right out then to Egypt, and Melanie had had a hard time convincing him that it was impossible. It was late. They were both ready for bed, and outdoors the rain was coming down in a great wet roar. Mom and Dad would never let them go alone, and if Dad went with them, the other Egyptians would never forgive them for giving away Egypt to a grown-up. Melanie had known that Marshall understood the importance of what she was saying, and that he was trying awfully hard to believe that it was all more important than finding Security. He had gone to the window and stood looking out at the waves of rain that swooshed against the pane. When he came back to Melanie's bed, his chin was wiggling. But Security will drown if I don't go get him, he had said. Melanie had taken hold of his shoulders. Marshall, honey, octopuses can't drown. They live in water, she had said. Marshall had hung his head, and finally he had sighed and said very softly, but Security is another kind of octopus. Just then, Melanie had thought of something that helped. You know what? I'll bet you didn't leave Security in Egypt at all. Now that I think about it, I don't remember seeing him there today. I'll bet you left him at nursery school. I'll bet he's safe and sound in the playroom at nursery school, and you can get him in the morning when you get to school. Then Melanie had taken Marshall back to his bed and tucked him in. She wasn't at all sure that she believed Security was at the nursery school, and she knew that Marshall didn't either. But they had both tried to believe it as hard as they could. In the morning, it had still been pouring down rain when it came time to go to school, and Melanie's dad had insisted on taking everyone to school in his car on his way to the university. So there had been no chance to check to see if Security really was in the land of Egypt. And just as they both had feared, he had not been at the nursery school. So there had been nothing they could do but wait for school to be over and the time for Egypt to come. Fortunately, it had stopped raining during the day, although the sun never came out. But when the time finally came and all 6 Egyptians squeezed back through the fence into Egypt, Security wasn't there either. The storage yard was wet and muddy and bare. Inside the temple, things were damp and messy from the wind-blown rain. Ashes and papers were blown around, and some plastic flowers had fallen off the bird bath. But there was no sign of Security anywhere. That day, Marshall wouldn't even take part in the ceremony. He just sat on a box against the fence and watched with big, sad eyes. Everybody tried to talk to him and cheer him up, but he wouldn't answer. Looking at him, the others remembered with a feeling of shock that he was awfully little. He usually seemed bigger. Somehow, no one felt very enthusiastic about starting the ceremony, without really knowing why. It was almost as if they were a little bit afraid of finding out whether there was any mysterious writing on the slip of paper that still hung damply limp from Thoth's beak. But alas, Melanie, whose turn it was to be the high priestess, got things going. She did pretty much what April had done the day before until she got to the part where she took the slip of paper out of Thoth's beak and read it. On one side was April's question, just what Melanie had thought it would be. When will I go home again? And on the other side, Melanie looked up at the other Egyptians with wide eyes, and then she turned and looked long and hard at Toth. Finally, she walked right out of the temple, threw the paper on the ground, and said, "I think we had just better stop playing this awful game." Everyone crowded around, grabbing for the paper and asking questions. As it went the rounds, it left a lot of startled faces behind it. The back of the paper, which they all knew had been clean and blank when they had left Egypt the night before, was now covered with writing. In the same small, wavery hand that had answered Ken's question, the oracle had written, "The best thing we can do is to make wherever we're lost in look as much like home as we can." Again, no one had seen the words being written. And again, what they said didn't sound like anything a kid would make up. Something very strange was going on. As one person, the 5 biggest Egyptians turned and looked at their temple. There on the left was the altar to Set that they had built themselves from nothing but an old egg crate. And on top of it was the made-by-hand statue of Set, looking a little more sunken and slimy than usual from the blowing rain the night before. On the right was the bird bath altar with the plaster head of Nefertiti, lovely and gracious in spite of the cracks and chips. And at the back was the new altar to Toth with its candles and incense still burning in front of an old stuffed owl that Toby had cut his teeth on. It had only been a game. Of course, it had been a very special one, more serious and important and mysterious than most, and a lot more fun. And there had been times when it had seemed to have a mysterious sort of reality about it. But no one had believed, when you came right down to it, that it was anything more than a game. At least, no one had until today. "I think Ross is right," Ken said suddenly. "I told you guys before there was something kooky about this whole thing." He grinned at Toby. "How about it, Tobe? You ready to go back to basketball?" Toby shrugged. "I think you guys are a bunch of chickens," he said. "Just when things get good and something really exciting starts happening, you want to cop out. What I want to know is, if you don't like a little excitement, why'd you start fooling around with stuff like Egyptian gods and ancient magic in the first place?" "Look, wise guy," April said, "it just so happens that I didn't say I wanted to cop out. And if you're so crazy about excitement, why don't you go jump off a bridge or something? That ought to be exciting enough to suit you. It just so happens that some people think there's such a thing as too much excitement." Toby grinned at April in a way that said he wasn't looking for a fight. "I'm not arguing," he said. "If everyone wants to split, it's all right by me. Let's just forget." "No!" Marshall said suddenly in a loud, clear voice. It was the first thing he'd said since he found out that security definitely wasn't in Egypt. "No!" Marshall got up off his box and came over to where the rest of them were standing. His chin was up and he was looking much more like himself. "Let's not stop. Let's not stop till I ask a question. I'm going to ask about security." Everybody tried to talk him out of it. April and Melanie and Elizabeth all tried because they could see how hard he was going to take it if the oracle didn't come through. And for some reason, Toby tried hardest of all. He squatted down by Marshall and talked to him a long time about how he didn't think that was the kind of question that oracles answered. But Marshall only shut his eyes and shook his head and said no. And everybody knew that Marshall never said no unless he meant it. So Melanie wrote, "Where is security?" on a piece of paper, because Marshall didn't do much writing yet. And Toby went through the ceremony just as he had the 2 times before. Marshall went home acting almost as if security had already been found, but everyone else went home worried. Melanie and April and Elizabeth and Ken didn't quite know whether to worry because the question might be answered or because it might not be. The whole thing was getting to be so weird and creepy that they couldn't really wish for another answer, but at the same time, what were they going to do about Marshall? But Toby was the most worried of all. And that's the end of this chapter.